Good evening, everyone. Great to be back with you, and I'm really pleased to have back on Matt Ehret, one of my favorite analysts and historians and authors. Thoroughly recommend that everyone follows you, Matt, at Substack, at the Rising Tide Foundation, which you established with your wife, Cynthia Chung, who also has done some incredible work that has been published there, and also at the Canadian Patriot Press. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Vanessa. Always a great pleasure to chat with you.
What I wanted to start off talking about, I know we always go off in various directions, is an article that you recently published at your Substack, entitled Russia in Africa, Connecting Continents with Soft Power. Now, I would immediately pick up on the soft power because, of course, we've been programmed into thinking that soft power, smart power, the not-for-profit industrial complex is bad, right? Because in the hands of the West, it has been used very much as a Trojan horse to infiltrate communities, to break them apart, to destabilize countries. So I'd like to address that. But first of all, we were talking about a press conference given by South Africa's Foreign Minister, Pandor, in the company of Anthony Blinken, very recently, in fact, in the last week. And I just want to play this to you and get your comment on it because I found it quite fascinating. First of all, there is a question from a US media person. Actually, it's not a bad question.
First, for you, Minister Pandor, the U.S. government has been adamant, as Secretary Blinken just reinforced, that it is not asking African nations to choose between Russia and China and the West. At the same time, the United States clearly is hoping to marshal support at the UN and elsewhere for its isolation of Russia, along with American allies. You made reference in a recent article to the failure on the part of some to appreciate the principles of sovereignty and freedom of choice that African nations must consider in this regard. Do you think that the United States and its European allies sufficiently appreciate the complex interest of African nations in this arena? And did you discuss that today with Secretary Blinken?
In terms of our interaction with some of our partners in Europe and elsewhere, there has been a sense of a patronizing bullying. You choose this or else. And the recent legislation passed in the United States of America by the House of Representatives, we found a most unfortunate bill that we'd hope the media would say more about, because when we believe in freedom, as I'm saying, it's freedom for everybody. You can't say because Africa is doing this, you will then be punished by the United States. So that's been a disappointing passage of legislation by one house, and we hope the other house will not agree to such offensive legislation. So indeed, it is important that all of us accept our ability to hold different opinions. We are, after all, sovereign nations that are regarded as equal in terms of the United Nations Charter. We may differ in terms of economic power and economic ability to influence development in different parts of the world, but what will make the world work is if we respect each other. This is very, very important. And one thing I definitely dislike is being told either you choose this or else. When a minister speaks to me like that, which Secretary Blinken has never done, but some have, I definitely will not be bullied in that way, nor would I expect any other African country worth its salt.
Brilliant, right?
Absolutely. Spot on. Spot on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's referencing the countering malign Russian activities in Africa Act, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So coming back to what is the difference between Russian soft power and American soft power?
Well, overall, I think that the key difference is found in the fact that Russia overall is approaching its neighbors, especially those in Africa, but really anywhere you see it conducting economic or business, from the standpoint of respecting the sovereignty of the nation that they're doing business with, there is an increasing coherence that we've seen, and we saw this with Lavrov's recent trip across 4 African states, beginning with Egypt and then moving on all the way through Ethiopia, which echoes or reflects a policy that is increasingly in conjunction with the China policy towards Africa, and both together are working hand in hand, as they are in Southwest Asia and many other parts of the world, in the Arctic as well, with the increasing polar Silk Road. We see expressions of this all over the world, but these two countries cannot be conceptualized as, Russia and China as being on two opposing teams. Biden has tried to float the idea, in his discussion with Putin some months back, that he believes that Putin is afraid of China and that Russia is being pushed up against by China. That's a delusion by the US State Department and the Western technocratic intelligentsia that tend to look at the world through the filter of a Hobbesian lens of each against all. And they're not able to recognize, although I think they are starting to come to terms with the fact that right now we do have a conjunction of a set of ways of thinking about not only the nature of the enemy, the unipolar agenda and all of its different aspects, but also a certain pathway towards a way to create a viable economic security architecture for the world premised around multipolarity, mutual respect for each other's cultures, developmental pathways, sovereignty of nations, which is very different from the sort of what the South African foreign minister was referring to, this condescending talking down to by a unipolar, a supranational elite telling you how to behave. So Russia, what we've seen has been a much more, even though they only have, I think, something like $20 billion in trade in Africa compared to China's $200 billion, it's still a huge leap up from what it was a decade ago. There's a huge expansion, but not just in terms of investments into pure mining, but Russia, just like China, is looking up very heavily at investments into infrastructure, special economic zones that are increasingly becoming industrial hubs in Zambia, Mozambique, big time in Egypt, and many other places, as well as this idea that Putin first enunciated in 2018 that Russia will light up Africa. And unlike the West, which is looking in there's a policy of technological apartheid, especially in regards to transport and energy, that's been maintained for decades by the West against Africa. There's a reason why Africa, despite the fact that they have the greatest riches of any continent in the world, have been kept in a state of a dark age or a near dark age in much of the continent. The amount of suffering, the lack of access to viable electricity or even interconnectivity it's wild. But that's been done by a design and intention to keep the country or the continent from having a standardized rail system that could unite the continent the way so many great Pan-African leaders have tried. And there's been no ability to access loans provided to them by the IMF or the World Bank for 70 years on developing forms of energy that are undesirable for the governing elite in the West that wants to keep them underdeveloped. So the coal resources, the oil, the natural gas under Africa's soil, the uranium deposits that are in abundance are not permitted to be used for the African people to industrialize. Whereas Russia has gone in, especially with the first Russia-Africa summit of 2019, and the head of Rosatom, for example, met with I think 40 of the African leaders who were present and discussed development projects or outlines for getting every African country, giving them access to nuclear power, third, fourth generation. Right now, South Africa is the only country which has it, only because they had a racist an apartheid state until the early 90s. So they were allowed to have nuclear power, but none of the Black African nations were permitted those technologies. Now Russia is coming in saying, no, we have to reverse this. This is a racist policy. And as well, coal, natural gas, other things are also being promoted as the same thing we see with China. So I think that's important, seeing the Russia-China thing as two sides of the same Africa policy.
Yeah. And okay, so we know through history that when the West has effectively mined the resources of a country, and Africa has been both colonized and raped and pillaged by the colonial powers, whether it is France, the UK. I think France is the primary one in Africa. Is that correct?
For North Africa, big time.
Yeah.
France Afrique, the
Yeah.
corporations of France that still manage the economies of North Africa, yeah.
So,
And Senegal.
I mean, we also know that in response to China's entry into the African market, and as you have mentioned, of course, when China comes in, instead of destroying everything in order to be able to reap the benefits of the resources of the prey nation, China is investing in infrastructure, in roads, in rail links, etc. Of course, it benefits from improving that infrastructure. But of course, what have we seen? We've seen the creation of terrorist groups like Boko Haram by the West in order to create that instability, to push back against the Chinese takeover, of course, as it's perceived in the West. The benefits of Russia and China economic intervention in these countries, do you think there is a possibility in the future that this is going to be allowed without the follow-up destabilization projects from the West? I think that's what I want to know.
Oh, dear God. No, I mean, that's absolutely what we should expect to continue seeing.
Yeah.
Much more asymmetrical warfare you mentioned. And I should just correct myself too. When I said North Africa, France Afrique, I don't know why I said that. It's obviously Mali, it's Senegal. I mean, there's so many other, but pretty much France, the French Empire, just like the British Empire or the Belgian Empire, never really disappeared or gave liberty or independence to their colonies, but rather kept economic controls throughout the years of the independence movements, Algeria being just one of many. And the increased utilization in the 80s and the 90s of terrorist groups like Boko Haram as a branch of Al Qaeda, which was again created by Operation Cyclone and the U.S. State Department and CIA in the throughout that period as part of the proxy war against the Soviet Union, is huge. And there's a variety of various groups that have been maintained with Western sponsorship. Ethiopia has been dealing with their own terrorist group with the Tigray People's Liberation Army, which is deeply enmeshed with the U.S. Deep state, and has been used as an excuse to destabilize Ethiopia, which is probably the strongest amongst the African nations right now, capable of standing on its own 2 feet, and with some of the deepest connections with China, which has helped Ethiopia build the Addis Ababa to Djibouti rail line, which will soon connect to a much broader continental African grid of rail, uniting the various countries. The projects are they're not just shovel ready, they're already being built. In some cases in Rwanda to the south, there's already the completion of various rail lines built with Chinese funds. China has a military agreement as well with Ethiopia to protect BRI, Belt and Road Initiative connected projects. Ethiopia also has the biggest, the Grand Renaissance Dam. So that's providing, it's going to be providing 6,000 plus gigawatts of hydroelectric power to not just Ethiopia, but all of its surrounding neighbors, including Sudan and many others who wish to have an industrial policy. So for sure, what we see are these separatist groups, these little balkanized, these different groups that are more than willing to kill their own people as far as achieving their objectives are concerned. And we find that a lot of the funding, the propaganda support, especially for a Western dumbed down audience, is being provided by the Western deep state. You have various people, I think, including the former Jim, I'm forgetting his name now, the former U.S. Head of NATO. I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, but you have various high-level officials from the U.S. representing the U.S. military-industrial complex, even advocating U.S. military intervention into Ethiopia to restore order, and of course, painting the Ethiopian government as the big bad villains. and ignoring completely the atrocities that have been done by the various rebels within the East Tigray Liberation Army in the north. So obviously, the reason why these things we should expect to see more of them, and I think Russia and China together have worked very hard to solidify a coalition of nations who are not willing to sanction Russia or even condemn Russia. I mean, most of the African nations who have been, strong-armed and intimidated by the West, especially by people like Blinken, to condemn Russia for their intervention into Ukraine, have refused to simply do that. They either abstained from voting or they simply said, no, we're not going to do that. And instead, they've welcomed Lavrov and other Russian and Chinese representatives to Africa with a warm embrace for obvious reasons. So yeah, no, I think that there's a danger of it, but I think they're also prepared. They're prepared in a way that we've never seen before, and I think that they're also working because it's not Africa going at it by themselves, because they have the protection of other countries who also recognize that we need a system of win-win cooperation, and they're also aware that the Western system is going to collapse. That's I think part of the what the Eastern or the Eurasian economic bloc has to its advantage is they've come, including Iran and other countries, to an understanding that the greatest enemy that the West has is itself, and it's sitting on a powder keg of a financial system that will melt down, and they just need to sort of bide their time in a sense as the West becomes more and more ungovernable. Which for people like me living in the West, that's sort of a bittersweet thing, But I think they're setting the stage for something very big and good, even for as far as the different agreements for a continental free trade zone for Africa, which is integrating more and more with Russia and China. It's a game changer in many ways. There's a lot of other free trade agreements, which are very different from Western free trade agreements in terms of the Egypt Eurasian Economic Union free trade agreement, the India-Russia free trade agreement, and everything that China has been doing as well. They're unlike the West, which promotes NAFTA and our Trans-Pacific Partnership, which are just giving corporations more power than God to rape and pillage while stripping nations of their ability to have any say over their economic destinies. The Eurasian approach to free trade agreements are premised around an actual intention to industrialize and develop, which is everything. That intention is everything.
There's also, of course, the weaponization of and the digital mining that's now going on in Africa, for example. I mean, you even got Jack Dorsey of Twitter transferring much of his wealth into Africa, etc. The introduction of universal basic income, even in African countries, and of course, many see that as a precursor to enslavement, of course, handing out pittance, the centralization of the economy, and simply handing out the crumbs from the table to the peasants, in inverted commas. That's how they're perceived, regardless of if it's Africa or the Middle East or even Western countries now. We've seen that in the last 2 years. We are we're the useless eaters. To what extent do you think that is? Because, we know that at the moment there is a discourse along the lines of, well, this whole idea of multipolarity is a mirage. In reality, we're just switching from I know you're really probably fed up of hearing this, but I think it's important to keep digging at it so that people fully understand what is going on. That this illusion of multipolarity is just another form of globalism, but it's coming in perhaps in a different way. It's coming in disguised as enrichment of these nations through infrastructure, etc. But then behind that is going to come the economic kosh, the debt enslavement. People always use this term in regards to China. Now, again, my experience in Syria, which is relatively anecdotal, but nevertheless, I've seen for the last 6 or 7 years how Russia and China are behaving towards a nation that they have come to the aid of. And there have been very few visible strings attached to that aid, in my view, right? What would be your response to people that are saying, well, yeah, but this is just another form of colonialism. It's another form of imperialism. It's no better than what we've already experienced, basically.
Mm. Well, I guess I think it's always useful to put oneself into the vicarious shoes of an oligarch. There's a certain, looking at studying history from the standpoint of acknowledging the existence of a continuous oligarchical organizational process that transcends our generation by far. This goes back centuries, if not millennia. There's certain characteristics of oligarchism which are invariants. The form changes over space and time, but there are certain commonalities which you'll find whether organizing the worst aspects of the Roman Empire or the Venetian Empire or the British Empire or today's Anglo-American expression of this thing. And I think among those, if you get into the mind of a grand strategist representing that way of trying to organize society, there are certain key things that one has to take note of. And for me, I put a lot of, I think it's very important to appreciate the obsession with stasis as part of the overall need for control, because these are control freaks. It is a control freak, mindset. It doesn't tolerate those who challenge their stability, their power structures. So there's a commitment to an idea of a crystallized arrangement of society between masters and slaves, those born into the majority born into slaves families who have to remain, fixed to their destiny, controlled by a master class who live in their castles. In feudal Europe, that had its expression with, serfs who were born in your plantation who were not legally different in any real way than talking cows. The idea of serfs, of the lowly talking cows who come up with ideas that are human, that pertain to freedom, justice, things like that allow them to break from the habits that you encourage them to have. Those are dangerous things. That's why, like the slave, in the Confederate America South, the Deep South, it was basically agreed upon by the masters, the real useless eaters who are the self-professed masters, who have no useful real skills but managing their human slaves. There was an agreement that if you discover a slave to have learned how to read by some miracle, then you should kill that slave before they teach it, So you have to sort of keep not only a situation of ignorance, but also keep the passions, like what Frederick Douglass, who became Lincoln's advisor, a great human who was born into slavery but escaped. He wrote his autobiography, and in it he points out that the greatest challenge he had to deal with, and I'm saying this all to get at the question of the motive of Russia and China, of course, but it's useful for context. But he said the greatest challenge was not freeing the slave of its shackles physically, but of the shackles of the soul. And the oligarchy, the Confederate families of the South had a policy of encouraging debauchery. So, when it would be a holiday, they would bring the male slaves to a brothel, get them as drunk as humanly possible, and have them and tell them that this is your freedom. This is what liberty is like. And they would get them to become so ashamed of their own intoxicated behavior that when they would work 15 hours a day throughout the rest of the year on the plantations, they saw that as preferable to freedom. And, in many cases, it was this, like, what's her name? There was many of the greatest challenges when slaves were trying to convince their fellow slaves to be free or to gain freedom and risk a lot, were the snitches, those who would think, oh, but you're challenging my way of life, and they would snitch on their fellow slaves in order to preserve their way of life, not even that they were going to get rewarded. So you have this whole artificial culture it takes on different expressions to encourage a not only peasant hobbit-like status for the slaves, but to discourage or to increase the passions of debauchery in those slaves as well, so that they don't actually have a clear sense of what true wisdom is, what true happiness actually is, as far as living a life for the higher pleasures, which come from being creative and making discoveries and overcoming the limits to our knowledge, which also have expression with the limits to growth. Because when we have limited knowledge of the universe, we can't do as much, right? If you're ignorant of aerodynamics, you're not free to start creating designs for planes. You have that freedom to create and to, defy gravity comes from not only a demand that you discover gravity's laws, but also that you willfully shape your own desires in obedience. So you have to be obedient to that law in order to have the freedom. That also increases in a variety of other ways. So the oligarchy wants stasis. They want to keep things in a crystallized state. They're premised on an idea that your hereditary privileges give you the authority to rule over others or to be ruled by others. That's whether it was the idea of the sacredness of your blood based on your, the fact that if I wasn't the most superior, which is something we see in ancient Babylon, ancient Athens, we see this in ancient Egypt. There's this idea that if I was not superior, if my blood in my family was not the best, then I would have been born into a slave family. It's that lame as far as low level logic. Today, under the neo-Darwinian systems, it's taken a different view of, this idea that science has proven that you have those who are just born with smart, better IQs, better talents, better, with greater rights to rule simply by your family. And you got these garbage studies being promoted by Scientific American and other news, fake science propaganda outfits trying to convince us that modern genetics has, defined in a predestined, they've sort of brought back predestination. So these are all the characteristics of the oligarchy in terms of the type of society they want to bring about. So when I look at, what are the effects of the policies economically or security wise of Russia, China, and that growing alliance of nations of Eurasia, do I see a motion towards stasis and the dumbing down of society, the stripping of the means of having full spectrum economies, which is what empires have always done, right? Get everybody addicted to cash cropping so that nobody has economic sovereignty because they're all just told they have to do one thing. They're not allowed to develop a full spectrum economy that allows them to stand on their own 2 feet. Do I see those effects or do I see something else? And so for me, when I look at it, everywhere I look at the Belt and Road Initiative's growth, the security interventions made by Russia and or China, whether in Southwest Asia or Africa, Asia more broadly, or what they've offered even for the West, if we were able to regain our senses, they've, the leaders of both countries have said, we're more than willing to work with you on win-win projects. And I look at what those projects are, it's $4 trillion currently that's being invested in the biggest macro development projects, which are having the effect of increasing the quality of life, increasing the technological capabilities of nations who had been exploited. It increases they're providing mass education. I've got a big mapping of all of the different countries of Africa where China has created cadres of tens of thousands of advanced engineers so that they have the skill sets to do this and teach their own people going forward, who are being provided massive free scholarships, free training at the best quality educational centers of China. Russia's done similar things, expanding scholarships across Africa and other countries to provide for the best, most advanced training to create nuclear engineers for Africa, which are things that the British Empire, the Anglo-American cartels, the French, the Belgium have never permitted any of those things. And they're building up industrial corridors, So these are all things that I don't see how the effect of a better quality, smarter population with nations that have greater full spectrum energy sources and industrial power of production themselves, how did this plays into the overall religious-like commitment by the oligarchy with its Great Reset ideology to, reduce the world population to less than 1 billion, shut down industrial civilization with green energy grids, which are crap. Like, I mean, honestly, on a scientific and moral level, green energy and economic is the worst approach to organizing your energy systems. I mean, that's all that they're doing. When I see them going to Africa with Ursula von der Leyen, going to various African countries and saying, you know, just cut off business with Russia and China, and we'll give you a lot of money. We'll give you billions of dollars, they say, as if they even have money to spend. They can't even like sustain their own population right now. And you can use it all for spreading windmills and solar panels all over Africa. You're going to destroy whatever little exists for Africa to actually leapfrog into the 21st century. They'll never have that if they spread solar panels all over the Sahara. Forget about it. So it's not very attractive. I think the Africans know that.
Yeah, and of course that was one of the triggers for what happened in 2014 in Ukraine, which was Yanukovych turned down the IMF loan in favor of a Russian investment plan.
Yeah.
And suddenly he's kicked out, and what is it, 17 million hectares of Ukrainian arable land comes under the control of Monsanto and various other oligarchical institutions. Right.
Yeah.
So there you have exactly, and then Ukraine effectively becomes a vassal state, and that's the Western MO, right? So I think you know, I understand, and I understand why people are getting hung up on certain elements of both society in Russia and China. Although I would argue that Russia now has greater press freedom. I see far more, particularly Western journalists, criticizing Russia, particularly with relation to the WEF and the WHO, etc., and being, you know, not being penalized in any way, shape, or form for doing so. Whereas in the West, well, we know what's happening in the West. I mean, there's an entire complex being built to bring us all down. Right, you know, where our window of expression is becoming narrower and narrower. Platforms are being weaponized against us, literally. You know, you had Eva Bartlett, actually her life put at risk by Twitter recently. So, you know, they are literally becoming weapons now in the hands of the Western-centric oligarchs. And so I totally understand why people, in a sense, they want to project what they have been led to believe is the norm onto any alternative, and particularly something that they inherently distrust. Many people inherently distrust China, right? Because they've been programmed to do so for years. And the same with Russia, but in a different way. And I think one of the things that I don't know if it was you or it was Jochen that said it in your Q&A session, and I've been sharing it everywhere, but I thoroughly recommend everybody. I'll put it in the show notes. But I think it was Jochen that made the point that technology is not the problem. It's whose hands are controlling that technology. You're not going to prevent the advancement of technology. That was one thing. And the other thing that he said, and I think this is so pertinent to what we're all going through at the moment, that people created society and people can recreate society. And what I tend to see, I don't necessarily agree with all the policies of China and Russia. You know, we've talked about China's policy towards Yemen. I'm utterly against that. But what I do see is that there is potential for nations to start learning to be sovereign nations again. You know, I've spent time in Iraq. I've seen how colonized the minds are there. That's after 30 years of US occupation. and for me, what I find exciting is, yes, countries can start to spread their own wings again instead of having them constantly clipped by a hegemonic supremacist non-partner, right?
Yeah, right, right. Well, I think that, and I mean, your on the ground life experience, I think, has given you a deeper sense of appreciation for the nature of the fight as it really is. Whereas a lot of people trying to make sense of the world are, they're in their comfortable part of the world. They haven't directly seen the fight.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more an intellectual exercise, and it's not as much accompanied by a real living life experience of having spoken to the people, having, it's deeper. The roots go deeper for you. So I think that you're able to see much more the fact that there is, this nuance, that there's no nation is perfect, obviously. But no nation is crystallized either. They're either in situations where it's a dynamic process that's being shaped by the forces of history, with fifth columns in every country, and things are either getting better at times or getting worse at times in every country. And I wrote a series of books with my wife called The Clash of the Two Americas, to basically address the fact that most people who I know have a view of America which is either America's all bad because it has done atrocious, terrible things in our lifetimes, and that's all it has ever done. And they reframe their understanding of American history without looking at any of the good that was ever done. That conflicts with their anger, and it's an understandable anger because so much damage has been done by the USA and so many atrocities. But it's like, well, what about the 8 American presidents who die while in office? There's been 4 bullets and 4 poisons. What about them? Like, what were they expressing? What were they doing? What about all of the other good things? And they can't see it. And then on the other hand, I noticed that there were a lot of people who just look at the United States and only see good, as if it could do no evil. And it's like, okay, if you're a patriot with that outlook, you're an idiot. Like, it's good to be an American patriot because I think there's something beautiful in the U.S. experience. But you could only be a good patriot if you are accepting of the evil that has also been done, by the United States. You can't go for extremes, which is what so many people tend to do. And they tend to do the same thing for China, or when they try to analyze China or Russia or other countries, they will tend to only see either all good. And there's no shortage of people who are just like cheerleaders for everything Russia and China do. They could do no evil. And then inversely, you got those who it's like, it's all evil. It's just look at what Mao did in the Cultural Revolution and look at, they'll just be shown images that are scary images of COVID-19 protocols, in Shanghai and stuff. And I don't fully understand all of that, but they'll just easily not look for context, and they'll just be like, okay, those images are proof to me that China is just this godless commie, super state of technocrats. That's all it is. That's all it ever can be. And they don't think about context, or like same thing for Russia. So I think it's important to be able to walk in the world a little bit of nuance to appreciate the forces who are patriotic and care about humanity existing in every country, and those who don't care. And then from that standpoint, you can better make sense of, I think, like, what is, today the Great Reset is the new name given to what we used to call the New World Order. That was the old slogan. They still call it that, but I mean, I think they gave it, the international rules-based order is a new repackaging. Great Reset is another one. And there are certain aspects of that great narrative that they're creating, and it is a giant narrative, which you see the Chinese and Russian and Iranian and other leaders at different times paying lip service to. And in some cases, you even see things like, the Fourth Industrial Revolution terminology and even systems being developed by Russia, by China. And what does that mean? What is the fourth? We know from the mindset of a Klaus Schwab, the Fourth Industrial Revolution is a very transhumanist idea that involves utilizing next generation technologies to enslave humanity. Doesn't matter what those technologies are, whether 3D printing, whether computer learning technology, whether quantum computing, all of that is intrinsically tools to enslave and dumb down people on behalf of a master class of Übermenschen. That's what it means. Now, when China and Russia use the words Fourth Industrial Revolution or advance scientific policies around that, what is their thinking? Do they have the same definition of the words? Because the idea goes back to the 1950s and 60s, and it simply was, part of a discussion of what the next generation of digital computing technologies would do, automation, what have you, as far as its relationship to the labor force and how that would change human economic systems. So that's a discussion that goes back a long time. Now, do these technologies intrinsically mean enslaving the masses and empowering an elite? Is that what 3D printing will do, or machine learning? Is that all it can do, or automation? Is that, or quantum computing? Is that all that these things can do, is enslave? No, they can also support better quality of life and liberate us from, doing menial, repetitive labor, because a machine can do anything which is, repetitive labor that doesn't require a lot of creativity can be done by a machine. Now, does that mean that there's going to be a crisis in the labor market? Kind of, but how do you overcome it? Do you get rid of useless eaters the way Yuval Harari says, or do you, is this an opportunity for people to now access their deeper aesthetic, creative components of their personalities? And a humanist, a proper humanist, would say, yes, this is a wonderful opportunity for people now to really develop their inner genius, their deeper potentials, and not just be talking cows working the plantation. A machine can do the work of 100 slaves. So that was understood by Lincoln to be the key for a sustainable emancipation of slavery could only occur through a real reconstruction of the South, meaning the expansion of industrial development, the expansion of high technology, which the old South never permitted. The old South slave masters were always, no, we're not going to use advanced technology because that would undercut our slave economy. And that was ultimately sabotaged. The Reconstruction was never permitted to happen. We know that after Lincoln was assassinated, again, through British steered intelligence operations in Montreal, Canada, which is a whole story unto itself. The deep state of the 19th century, which was, again, always aligned to the city of London, inside and deeply embedded as a fifth column in the United States, took back control both in the north around Wall Street as well as their southern partners. And the slave power basically took back control. They undermined the spread of Reconstruction. And instead what we saw was a reemergence of, things like, the first real domestic terror movements under the KKK was set up by a Confederate general who was tied to this Freemasonic network of Giuseppe Mazzini named Albert Pike, who reformulated, Southern Rite Freemasonry with his morals and dogma, big occultist. But he's the guy who created the Knights of the Golden Circle as a terrorist group that was the KKK, which then set the basis for the Jim Crow laws. And so it's weird, right? Like a century after emancipation, you have Martin Luther King having to fight in the deep South to give Black people the right to vote and have civil liberties. And you're like, wait a minute, how did that happen a century after slavery was fully banned and the Civil War was won? How is it that they're still fighting this when in South Carolina in the 1870s, you had something like 11 Black people who became state senators in South Carolina in the 1870s. And then a century later, you can't even drink at the same water fountain as a white person. How did that happen? And it's because there was this reinflammation of this Anglo-steered, the city of London steered deep state structure in the United States. And so, today you have Russia, you have China. They've been forced to accommodate, I think, through a position of weakness that they had about a decade ago. They were much weaker than they are today. They didn't control the narratives of, the Great Reset and what have you. So they accommodated some of that, but they tried to steer it into their favor by redefining things like sustainability from being one of greening and depopulation using green energy, the way we have it in the West, towards sustainable development. So that's why China is producing, they sabotaged not only COP 14, COP 21, but also COP 26 decarbonization programs, and are now the biggest investor in hydrocarbon energy investments. And they're expanding, things that involve the greening of deserts, hydroelectric dam building. It's all being expanded by these countries, and that's their idea of green, because they're saying, well, if you want to be green, let's green a desert, right? Let's desalinate some water. Whereas in the West, it's, if we want to be green, we have to stop all human activity and make more deserts, like they're doing in California. By California, they're actually so insane that in the midst of an energy and food crisis, they're destroying 4 of their vital dams to liberate the deserts, to bring the deserts back. And I mean, my God, they're that ideologically driven by this idea of stasis of nature as a perfect equilibrium. Or spread solar panels across the Sahara, which is going to do what? It's going to make more deserts, because the solar panels are going to only increase the heat hitting the desert by 5 degrees or more, which is going to increase the desertification. Very different idea.
Yeah, and while they're still waging wars globally, and the military-industrial complex is probably the greatest contributor to the destruction of the planet and the pollution of waterways, etc. So I mean, this always, to me, just makes a complete mockery of their so-called green agenda anyway. And I think what's interesting, I was just thinking while you were talking, and I mentioned this in my conversation with journalist George Eliason last night, is what has really impressed me, first of all, because I would also bring Iran into the non-aligned axis. And, you had the Tehran meeting recently, I think on the 19th of July, with Putin, Erdogan, and Raisi, and obviously the Ayatollah Khamenei also. But when I look at the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Unit in Iraq, that was responsible for the defeat of ISIS without any help at all from the United States. I remember speaking to Mohandes, the leader, in 2017, and being so impressed. He was a former architect and engineer. Of course, he was assassinated by Trump with Soleimani in 2020. But basically, his engineering background led him to, while they were advancing from a military perspective, behind, they were rebuilding everything, right? And this is what we're also seeing in Donbass, right? I mean, because I actually asked George, I said, are these images true? Because it's extraordinary the speed with which Russia is rebuilding, and the Donetsk and Luhansk Popular Front are rebuilding, right? Entire areas that have been decimated by the war since 2014, including Mariupol. And I think this for me was just, it's a absolute encapsulation of the difference. Let's look at the United States and the destruction of Mosul and Raqqa. Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria. Where were they when it needed demining and it needed rebuilding? Of course they weren't there. It's destroyed. They've achieved what they wanted to do. They've achieved the ethnic cleansing pogrom, right? They've implanted their settler class, the Kurdish separatists, okay? And that's it, job done. And this for me is, I don't know, this to me exemplifies everything that you've been talking about. And we come back to the fact that, are there going to be policies from Russia and from China that are not going to be entirely welcome to the nations that they are collaborating with? Maybe. But again, in Syria, what I've seen is Russia may have a concept of where it wants things to go. But ultimately, Damascus has control. I've never seen that change, right? Never.
Yeah.
In 11
Yeah.
years, I've never
Right.
seen Damascus stripped of its sovereignty or its control over a situation. Never.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And China always does emphasize, and you see the proof in the pudding. Like, I mean, you, ask the Africans who are actually doing the business with China instead of like going to Epoch Times or some Westerner trying to interpret how you should think about how China is doing business, or the CFR or something. Look at what they're actually saying and looking what they're doing. And China has always emphasized that even though they have this grand design for the new Silk Road, which has all sorts of extensions, there's 3 different routes being co-developed through from east to west, to Europe, but also down into Africa, which has a continental grand strategy. I mean, there's like, what is it? The Africa Agenda 2063 program, as built by the African Union in Ethiopia, has as an integral component the not only a trans-African highway of 56,000 kilometers of highways to finally connect all of the nations, much of whom are landlocked, but also 9 high-speed rail lines, which they want to build. And this is all being made possible because of China. And this is already being built. There are already high-speed rail lines being built by China in Senegal, connecting from Dakar through to its neighbors east to west into Addis Ababa, which is just a little skip from Yemen across the Red Sea and the Bab el Mandeb Strait. It's a 26-kilometer leap, and there's been for decades discussions and engineering feasibility studies that have been done on extending rail through a bridge across Africa from Djibouti to Yemen and deeper into the Gulf states as part of, but that cannot happen under a globalization or a post-Great Reset type of technocratic system of depopulation. You just can't have that. But now what we're seeing is a renewal of these types of discussions, but not just discussions anymore. There's actual practical building. But China is always making a point that in every African country, they ultimately have to do it themselves, and they have to determine their own development pathway. They're not going to tell you what to do to, that, like Museveni, he's done a fair bit of evil in his day, but he's, come out and he recently said, like, the reason why we trust Russia and China is that they're not dictating to us what to do or how to have good governance. They want us to build infrastructure, and they're doing everything possible to help us do it, but they're leaving it up to us to get it done. And they're providing training, they're providing loans and investments at hardly any conditionalities. The only condition is you build it, right? Whereas the IMF, it's like, we'll give you a $10 billion loan to some poor country, but on the condition that you only allow our Western cartels to come in, control the minefield or whatever, Barrick Gold or whatever, and you reorganize your governance structures to ensure that our puppets are kept in a managerial position within your nation state, keeping you essentially a neo-serf. So China has had none of that. They're always respectful of the general choice by whatever nation that they do business with. And if they're doing business with a nation where corruption is endemic, they're not telling them to get rid of corruption before we build your hospital system. They're just saying, make the bribes happen where they got to be made, but build the hospital system. Very different from the West.
Yeah. Exactly.
So yeah, I think it's a very different and much healthier attitude. Knowing, of course, that if you want to deal with terrorism, you want to deal with all of these problems that are plaguing the West, like, did the war on terror help reduce the danger of terrorism in the last 20 years? No, it's only made it so much worse. We've created so many more nations that hate us in the West, more people who are poor, more radicalizable. China's had the same problem with terrorism. They share a 70-kilometer border with Afghanistan. They've had hundreds of terrorist attacks up until 2014, 2015. The difference is that they responded not by bombing a country back into the Stone Age the way the West has done, but they started, these re-education centers for people who are the most radicalized by Wahhabite, conditioning in their radicalized mosques in Xinjiang. But it's not just re-education. And this is not concentration camps. When you actually look at it, they're providing trades. Like
Yeah.
these are trade schools. They're teaching Mandarin, civics, but they're providing welding, carpentry, other things, and they're providing opportunities for when these people actually go back into the labor force. They have all sorts of quality jobs now to build infrastructure. You know, there's 2 high-speed rail grids in Xinjiang. I don't have any high-speed rail in Canada. They got better internet service in Xinjiang in much of Tibet than I have in Montreal. You know, so it's the idea is through economic opportunity and development, you are going to reduce the actual environment, or you're going to transform the environment in which terrorism emerges. You get rid of despair, and terrorism is the consequence of despair. You know, so people think, okay, I've got nothing to live for. I've been born into a hellish situation, and they don't have a lot of education opportunities. Somebody provides them an offer to have like $500 to go and fight jihad, you know, and they'll take it, you know, and they'll take the training. They won't ask questions. They won't see that it's the CIA manipulating them. And you will tend to, if somebody has hope and they have a role to play, they see a purpose for themselves as doing something good for their society by being an engineer, by building something, they're not going to take that $500 check, you know, to go and blow themselves up. So it's a different attitude. I think a different respect for human nature. And I think it's something which it could work and it does every time it's been done throughout history, this sort of thing. It's always been the same thing. It always works this way. That's why Franklin Roosevelt's approach to the New Deal of building thousands and thousands of big and small infrastructure projects after the Great Depression was enough to denazify the fascist impulse within the American people that had gone very big. Like there were Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden in New York with 50,000 Americans. You can see these pictures. It's disturbing. And Nazi rallies with George Washington and Hitler and the swastika marching through the streets of Washington and New York, and even here in Quebec, where we had, you know, major Nazi rallies where they were supporting eugenics. This idea that, you know, it's the Jews, it's the unfit, it's the people with low IQs who are the useless eaters who are holding us down, and that's why we have a Great Depression, and that's why I can't feed my kids. So people were becoming much more radicalizable in poverty and starvation, in fear, and they were becoming fascists. And it was only by providing a massive, hopeful vision, which involved also breaking up the Wall Street banks, you know, sabotaging the City of London 1933 Great Reset Conference for a world government under a banker's dictatorship, which Roosevelt also did. Nobody talks about that in history books, but he sabotaged a one world government program that was about to happen in 1933. All of that had to happen in order for him to take back national controls of credit from the private financiers and start moving that credit from speculation and unpayable debts into creating real wealth, which is very similar in spirit to what China has done with the Belt and Road Initiative and what Russia is moving towards more quickly now that, you know, the West they're not they're basically being told any hope you have right now to play with the West is over. So now they have more liberty in a sense to start taking control of their banking destiny more and more. So that fight is on, but China's more advanced in that. It looks much more ironically like what the U.S. had done under its better times of Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt than what the U.S. is today. It's quite the irony that I blows my mind.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you look at the West, MO again is divide and conquer, partition, and keep countries destabilized, whereas what you're describing is very much a unite and benefit. You know, coming back to Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, right, which is something that is an anathema to the West. Like that's the last thing they want. Any kind of sorry, the kids are taunting the dogs. Come here, Daisy. Come here. You know, I think that is a marked difference between the two policies, and something that for me, I mean, I wanted my last question to you maybe, because I think people are struggling with it, and just a quick upbeat response from you. How do you maintain optimism about the future? Because I think a lot of people are struggling with this at times.
That's a good question. Well, for me, I I look to history for strength, and I know when you really dig into a study of how history has unfolded, you start appreciating that it's a bit of a miracle that we ever made it out of feudalism. Like if you were thinking from the standpoint of statistics, you would have totally have betted against humanity so many times over. um and it is a big paradox. How is it that, with 95% illiteracy in 13th 14th century medieval Europe, how is it that we were able to, and I mean a centralized control of an oligarchical set of families managing the herd? I mean, there was not a lot of opposition to that. So how was it within just a few centuries we were able to establish a new type of system of nation states as the basis of international law to create a situation where the vast majority had access to literacy, to reading, to expecting certain freedoms that were only a dream a few centuries earlier? Um, how did the American Revolution even happen? It's a bunch of farmers fighting against the world's most organized global power of the British East India Company. They're, Hessian soldiers, mercenaries, and uh, and an army with no real limits to their resources. This British Empire was defeated by a bunch of farmers mostly, and so you would have bet against that. I would have been, if you were a gambler, you would have been like, no, my money's on the British Empire. My money's on the feudal, slave owners of the medieval period. I don't even think looking at the earlier on, even, how did we even get out of caves? Like, why are we not caving? It's all a miracle that we've been able to leap beyond our limits, the limits that were always press upon our potential to sustain our people at a certain quality of life, standard of living, quantity of people, which has a moral component to it. It's not just technology in some cold utilitarian sense. There's obviously a conjunction of both a intellectual leaping, a moral improvement, as well as a material expression in terms of organizing our relationship to the periodic table, to nature, in a way that gives us a greater power to sustain more people at a higher quality of life with more access to our minds, our mental, metaphysical properties, right? And so you couldn't get in medieval Europe an Einstein or a Max Planck or a Beethoven. It just wasn't available. It's not like there weren't babies that could have accessed that potential to produce these great scientific or artistic discoveries of a Da Vinci or something, but it wasn't politically possible to have that. People didn't tap into, they had no means to build the spiritual infrastructure. And same thing for Africa today, or the Africa under colonialism. Every baby could be the next brilliant, genius of the arts and sciences, but they're not given those opportunities, and instead they're forced into an artificial set of choices in life, living as a child miner, in Congo, mining rare earths and lithium for our cell phones and solar panels. 40,000 kids, who are not developing their potentials. So for me, that's it. I mean, I think I look at history from the standpoint of a battle. I try my best to read source material by people. I read, St. Augustine's writings of the City of God, his Confessions, his Platonic dialogues. I try to read Plato. I try to read, I look for people who seem to have had a positive influence by their life's work on humanity. And then I try to read their writings and see if I can get something out of it. And usually I do. I think, and I find that that's a similar experience for people who do that sort of thing, who read Benjamin Franklin's writings. Because I mean, again, Ben Franklin, right? I'm ranting, but I mean, Ben Franklin discovered electricity. He trumped all of the great scientists of Europe who were arrogant, who had the best minds of the world, couldn't figure out the nature of electricity, static or otherwise. And this guy with a grade 3 education from the backwater outskirts of humanity in the, in Philadelphia, the colonies, was able to make the discovery in 1750 that no one else was able to make. And he expressed that by having something like, he had 150 patents. He created games to popularize science, not as something that's just for the elites, but that, everybody could engage in, could interface with, could improve upon. So things like patents were created to encourage your farmers to come up with new ideas that they could have intellectual property rights over, and then have some monetary incentive for their ideas that would then play back into benefiting all of society. And he also worked with the elites of Europe, and that's how he was able to polarize the courts of France and many allies and even Britain, to industrialize Manchester with his Lunar Society. That was a Ben Franklin. People say, oh yeah, industrialization, that was the British innovation, kind of, but it was put into motion by Ben Franklin when he was the ambassador to Britain in the 1758 period. He created the Lunar Society. He created all of these things. Same thing for France, and that was what allowed him to become a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he organized Ekaterina Dashkova, this woman president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, this beautiful soul, 32 years old, president, ally of Catherine the Great. And she made Ben Franklin an honorary member, and she organized Russia to become the head of the League of Armed Neutrality that ensured American success, and so he was able to operate on such a holistic level that he didn't see a difference between his discoveries of electricity, his inventions, his innovations in economy, as well as his political revolution that he created in 1776. They were all different parts of the same thing. And he was looking at Confucius. You could read his writings, and he says, I get my inspiration by Confucian philosophy. He was the first one publishing Confucius's Analects into English with his printing presses. And he wanted America originally to be a meritocracy, much like the civil administration system of China. That was his orientation. He didn't want it to be what it became under a deep state. So, you've got, I think, a lot of evidence that ultimately humanity is made for something more than feudalism, technotronic or other, and ultimately, the universe resonates to good ideas in a way that allows us a greater freedom to have more access to our deeper potentials. History proves that, and when civilizations collapse into a dark age and ideas once were cherished are forgotten, and that's what happens in dark ages. It's not just population levels collapse, but it's everything else collapses too. You forget things you used to know. That's also, it's a lawful thing that the universe doesn't tolerate stupidity and immorality indefinitely either. So it's not a sign that the universe is bad. It's like, it's the sign that the universe is good and we're bad by choosing willfully to embrace and tolerate folly. And we have to, like Machiavelli said, if a society comes to a brink of empire and collapse, it has two fates. One is to either suffer the consequences of being evil and collapse, or return back to your foundational principles. And he, of course, was talking about, his analysis of the Roman Empire having abandoned its republican roots, because Cicero was killed and the republic became an empire. And Machiavelli was basically warning his contemporaries that fate is for everybody for all time. Either you return back to what was good about you at your roots, or you just embrace your folly and you collapse. So we're at that stage right now, I think, between two systems. And we know what definitely doesn't work. We see the collapse coming on faster and faster. It's a lawful collapse. And then we have an underdefined future where there's a vying over what conceptions, what paradigm is going to define what comes online to replace the currently defunct order. And will it be something that's premised on the worst ideas of humankind, or something that is in alignment with natural laws? Something I have faith is, natural law will win the day. I hope in my lifetime. We'll see.
Oh, thank you, Matt. As always, it's good to end on a more upbeat, and I totally endorse what you've just explained. Matt, are you working on anything in particular right now? Where should people go to find your work? I know I mentioned it at the beginning, but just let them know again.
Yeah, okay. Sure. Always working on a bunch of things. They can go to matthewehret.substack.com, which is sort of my bread and butter. It's a free newsletter, but people can go for the paid upgrade subscription. And with that gives you access to all of the PDFs of my books that some of them I've co-written with my wife, Cynthia, and also invitations for our weekly seminars, which we do every Sunday. We're going to have Ray McGovern on this Sunday going through a geopolitical briefing.
Great.
And also there's CanadianPatriot.org. It's not just Canadian politics, it's a bit of everything. And the books are all available there to purchase too. And lastly, I think the RisingTideFoundation.net is a little bit more on the aesthetics, cultural, educational orientation side of things. And we try to keep that for the soul food. So yeah, that would give people a lot to work with if they do those things.
Matt, thank you so much for coming on again. I'm sorry it's sort of gone on a bit longer than we anticipated, but absolutely brilliant.
Don't be sorry. These are I love talking with you guys. Don't be sorry. I could have talked. We could have gone on for another half hour. I'm enjoying this.
All right, Matt. Thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing. It's invaluable right now. And speak to you again very, very soon. Take care.
Coming from you, Vanessa, that's a huge, amazing compliment. Thank you. And thank you for doing what you're doing. Bye.
Bye.